Ricardo Duchesne is a Canadian historical sociologist and professor at the University of New Brunswick. His main research interests are Western civilization and the rise of the West. Born in Puerto Rico, Duchesne studied history at McGill University and later at Concordia University. In 1994, he received a doctorate in social and political thought at York University. His dissertation, All Contraries Confounded, Historical Materialism and the Transition to Capitalism Debate, was awarded the Doctoral Prize Award for Best Dissertation of the Year in 1995. Also in 1995, Duchesne was appointed assistant professor in the Department of Social Science at the University of New Brunswick, where he has remained since. Duchesne's publications include 3 books, 42 refereed articles, 1 chapter, 13 encyclopedia articles, and numerous articles in magazines, newspapers, and academic online venues. His book, The Uniqueness of Western Civilization, a major work of 528 pages, was released in February 2011. In 2017, he published 2 books, Faustian Man in a Multicultural Age and Canada in Decay, Mass Immigration, Diversity, and the Ethnocide of Euro-Canadians. Dr. Duchesne believes that the reading of great books from cover to cover is essential to a university education, and we welcome here tonight. Thank you for coming, Duchesne.
Okay, glad that you have me here and we can talk to a group of young individuals.
Your books focus a great deal on the state of the discipline of history, especially with respect to how that relates to the changing ideological landscape of Western academia. I wanted for a little bit for you to introduce sort of the core issue that your work goes over, especially with respect to the state of history. What is the core issue that you're tackling when you talk about history as it's developed in the contemporary age?
Well, history is a huge subject, and obviously you can talk about a whole range of issues, but I would say that the rise of the West, or Western uniqueness, as I prefer to say, is probably the biggest question in history. I know that that is subject to debate. There are some other huge questions that have been debated endlessly, like the origins of the First World War, the Second War, the Reformation and the Enlightenment and so on. And you can also have major questions about other civilizations and cultures, including questions that are outside the West, like the origins of agriculture, the rise of civilizations, and so on. But I would say still that the rise of the West, what makes the West different from other civilizations, is the most interesting and the most educational question of all. So when I was a student, I was always interested in big historical issues, and I wasn't sure that I was going to write about the West. Initially, I was thinking that I just want to know the basic patterns of history, and I would study why it was that hunting and gathering societies in some areas of the world eventually began to practice agriculture and how civilizations emerged thereafter, and those big general questions. But gradually I began to realize that the one question that really interested me was the rise of the West, because the West is the place where you see the modern world emerging, the world that we are still talking about, what is its nature, how it is affecting human life, and so on. And my sense initially was that I was a Marxist, so as you noted there, my dissertation was on the transition from feudalism to capitalism, which is a big Marxist debate. So initially, I addressed the rise of the West in terms of that one question that you can say it's about the origins of capitalism and why it was that capitalism emerged in Europe first. But eventually, I realized that there were a whole range of other questions that were fundamental to understanding Western civilization. Today, if you read the major works of historians, they think that capitalism is still the issue, or they would say others that it is the rise of an industrial civilization. They are still debating that as if it were the defining issue of the West, but I think that that's one transformation. The Industrial Revolution is one transformation among many others that are just as important, like the Scientific Revolution, the Reformation, the Renaissance. And as I kept investigating these big transformations, I realized that the West has been experiencing major transformations from the beginning of time, all the way back to ancient Greece and even before ancient Greece. And so I began to pose a different question, and that is, what makes the West so unique that you witness what people call the miracle of ancient Greece, the rise of the Roman Empire, all the achievements of the Middle Ages, and all the way to modern times. And eventually I realized that one had to go even before ancient Greece to the Indo-Europeans and the very different lifestyle that they developed thousands of years before ancient Greece. And that's a prehistorical question. So people who have read my book will realize that I do spend considerable time addressing the Indo-European culture. I call it the aristocratic, warlike culture of Indo-Europeans. And I think that at that point is when you see the beginnings of Western uniqueness. So that's really what I began to investigate and that I concentrated on in my book, The Uniqueness of Western Civilization.
Okay. And when you moved on to Faustian Man, how did you modify that picture?
Well, I published Uniqueness in 2011, and already when I was writing that book, I was kind of realizing that there were these big contemporary issues happening that needed to be addressed. And I would say that basically the question that was beginning to concern me right after Uniqueness is, why is the West, the civilization that rose and achieved so much, in such a state of doubt and decline? Why are so many people against it and trying to diversify it? And as I kept thinking about that, it seemed to me that the usual answers for Western decline, whether it be about lack of innovations in the way that you saw them in the 19th century and early 20th century, whether it be the breakdown of the family and a whole range of things that people talk about the West today, that you can identify as cultural decadence. Spengler had already written about that, that he felt there was no longer as much creativity in his time, which is the early 20th century, and he didn't think there would be any more. Although later he changed his view and said, well, there's not going to be artistic, philosophical creativity, but the West is still capable of scientific and technological supremacy. And as I began to think about that, when I wrote Faustian Man, and I was reading now many other books and sites that were not welcome in academia, I came to the conclusion that race was an important component of our Western identity. So I would say, if you had to sum it up in one word, what makes Faustian Man different from Uniqueness is that in Faustian Man, I address the racial characteristics of Western civilization. I began to look at the ways in which the West may or may not have been a European ethnic civilization. Where can you locate the West throughout history? So, for example, if you're looking at the Roman Empire, and as you know, the Roman Empire extended itself beyond the European continent into Africa and the Near East. So I kind of asked myself, is every area of the Roman Empire really Western, even though you had Roman institutions implemented in Africa and in the Near East, were they really Western? And one of the things that I observe is that those areas that were outside Europe, once the Roman Empire began to decline, they were quickly absorbed by non-European people.
You mean the Byzantine Empire and other outlying areas?
Yeah, the Byzantine Empire is a tricky area to examine because it does continue the Roman traditions in many ways. I mean, that was the area where Greek and Roman learning was preserved after the 5th into the 6th and 7th centuries. And after that, when Rome was in a state of chaos and these Germanic barbarians came in. But still, I felt that the center of the West still remained Europe proper, whereas Byzantine was kind of halfway. It had many Western characteristics, but it also was under the influence of nearby Near Eastern civilizations, and eventually it was not the place where you see continuous creativity. They preserve a lot of the Greco-Roman heritage, but they don't really introduce novelties, and you don't see that much creativity in arts and philosophy, whereas in the Western side, in Latin Rome and Latin medieval Europe, you start seeing a revival after the 10th century. But even before that, the Germanic peoples, as I argue in Uniqueness, were full of vitality and energy, and they kind of brought that early European energy back into Europe. And so I don't see the barbarian Germanic period as a period of chaos, and most historians view it in a very negative way. I don't see it that way just because Rome was integrating. In a way, Rome had already disintegrated, and it was good that it disintegrated because you needed this new energy coming from the German barbarians.
So you don't consider, say, the legal developments in Byzantine, the compilation and refinement of Roman law to be a development genuinely? You think it to be a sort of you don't consider it to be a creative development in the East?
Oh no, it is. I mean, the way that under Justinian, this is the 1600s AD, the way that under his reign, they put together the Roman legal tradition into these works that are well known. The Latin names now, I have to get back to give you the precise wording of those titles, major legal works. But there is no question that Byzantium contributed a lot by really consolidating in a unified way what the Romans had done legally. And this legal tradition, the Byzantines preserved it and then expanded on it, and then the West, during the papacy, the papal revolution of the 12th century, starting in the 11th century into the 12th century, the so-called papal revolution took this Byzantine preservation and then really elaborated upon it. And some people talk about a papal revolution as being another major epoch in Western civilization in the 11th and 12th century. It has to do with a more clear separation between the different spheres of the Christian religion and secular law, and then just the clearer breakdown of different types of law: feudal law, royal law, merchant law, and so on. So this was very important. It laid the foundations for the Western legal tradition thereafter, after the 11th and 12th century.
Would I be right to characterize your understanding of the difference between the Occidental and the Oriental post-Roman Empire as a difference between majority ethnic control in the West and minority ethnic control in the East? That is to say, if I understand you, Latin post-Roman area, Latin Christendom, seems to be controlled by ethnically Indo-Europeans, almost entirely, if not entirely. And Oriental Christendom, with the exception of, I suppose, the Russian areas, is controlled by Indo-Europeans of a sort, but ruling non-Indo-Europeans of different kinds. Would that be correct?
Yes, Yes, there is. I talk about briefly about the orientalization of the Byzantine world. The fact that you have a situation in which the emperor view himself as not just a secular ruler, but as the ultimate head of Christianity. So they did not separate Christian religion from politics, but converge them together uh, in a way in which the political side absorb the religious side
into what might have been traditionally called Eastern despotism, relatively speaking.
Yeah, it was more despotic. The emperor expected everyone, including members of the elite, to act subservient towards him. You don't have what you start seeing in Europe, autonomous cities, um, different types of laws. So even though Byzantium was very important in preserving the Roman legal tradition, they didn't advance it in such a way that you have the separation of even different legal spheres, so that merchants could have their own type of law, peasants could have their own type of law, and the aristocratic feudal classes also have their own type of legal ways. You don't have that in Byzantium. It's a situation in which the ruler really is the ultimate legal authority. That you don't see that happening in the Latin West.
Do you consider yourself a Christian?
Well, not a practicing Christian, but to me, the Christian tradition is fundamental to understanding the West. And there is a lot of debate nowadays. There are quite a few people in the alt-right, if you like, who want to talk about the pagan tradition, and they feel that Christianity is an alien religion, an Oriental religion. And I disagree with that, because even though you can argue that Christianity originated among the Jewish people, and that the Jewish people were not quite Western, particularly in ancient times, there is no question that from the very beginning, even among Jews themselves, they are under the heavy influence of Hellenistic Hellenism culture, and that they read Plato and other Greek thinkers who allow them to conceptualize God in a more philosophical, profound way than they would have done so. And there are books about this that show that the influence of Greek philosophy was already there in the very development of Judaism. And then once you get to Christ and afterwards, you see this with Paul, that he himself is Hellenized. He is in many ways a Roman citizen, not just as a matter of fact, but also in the way he was culturally raised. And
it's rarely noticed. It's rarely noticed, for instance, that all of the New Testament is in common Greek and not in, for instance, any of the local Semitic languages at all.
Yeah, he made his appeals to Rome. It was almost as if he was aware that Christianity could really flourish by persuading Roman authorities about its value. So he made these trips to Rome all the time. There was a sense in which they knew that Rome had a great history. He had created an empire, and that within this empire, Christianity could work and expand. And as later theologians argue, it could really become a universal religion within the universal political empire of Rome. So Christian thinkers, and you see all kinds of debates among Byzantine theologians and then Roman Latin religious figures, that they're debating the relationship between Christianity and the Greek Roman tradition. And it depends who you're reading. Some of them minimize or want to emphasize the Christian faith so much that they tend to downplay the Greek Roman tradition. But overall, when you examine St. Ambrose and other theologians of that period. There are many kind of difficult names to remember from Byzantine times. There is a sense in which they really appreciated what the Greek philosophers had accomplished, what Roman writers had accomplished, because this was the education. If you were an educated person like St. Augustine, he was deeply educated in Roman writings and Greek philosophy, and he would never have been able to write the City of God without this Greek Roman education. So to me, that shows that Christianity, it's very sophistication. The very book, the City of God, which is such a central book in Christianity, would not have been written without that tradition. So I do see an integration of Greek, Rome, and Christianity, and afterwards the Germanic component also becomes integrated into this. So in that sense, Christianity is Hellenized and Romanized and Germanized and becomes part of the Western tradition.
I want to ask a question. This is a question directly linking to the topic of Christianity itself.
Go ahead.
There was one particular review of your book, The Uniqueness of Western Civilization, that I liked, and it was a critique of it by Kevin MacDonald, who pointed out to you that Northwestern Europe specifically was most likely genetically independent of the Indo-European invasion coming from the East. Genetic data indicates that Northwestern Europeans do not have a large admixture from Indo-European invasions coming from the Ukrainian basin. And they have largely developed unique characteristic and cultural traits over the last 1,000 years, mainly as a result of laws that were implemented during the reign of the church as a powerful institution and cultural arbiter. In the West, like for example, marriage laws, inheritance laws, that are thought by many in the human biodiversity community to be one of the main factors that has resulted in a particular individualistic spirit amongst Northwestern Europeans. Maybe one of our major advantages that have led to the Industrial Revolution, but nowadays one of our major weaknesses as well, especially in Northwestern Europe. Do you think that Christianity itself is in a way, due to its cultural significance and the laws that came about during its reign as a major religion and cultural force in our societies, do you think Christianity is, in a way, the West itself? It's determinant of our spirit. It has not just shaped our theological outlook, but in a way, due to gene culture coevolution, our genetics as well.
Well, no, I wouldn't put it that way, and I don't think Kevin MacDonald would put it that way. As you started saying, before the Europeans arrived in Europe, there were already in Europe European peoples. As I argue in Faustian Man, I didn't recognize this as much or barely at all in uniqueness because I was concentrating on the Europeans, but there's no question that Kevin MacDonald is correct to say, and he accepts my Indo-European thesis, but he's correct to say that it's not as if Indo-Europeans arrived into an empty space in Europe. There were hunters and gatherers that have been evolving both racially, genetically, and culturally in Europe before the Indo-Europeans arrived. So these people were there, and they were, if you like, white. They were becoming white, and they were part of the genetic makeup of Europe, and they were not Christian. But I think Kevin MacDonald would agree that onto that background of Europeans before the Europeans arrived in Europe was added this aristocratic Indo-European culture, then the Greeks and the Romans, and then eventually Christianity. See, it's simply a question of chronology. You cannot say chronologically that at the basis of Europe is Christianity. There are many people, conservatives, who want to say that. They want to insist, and they will say Judeo-Christianity. So it became a term that was started to being used in the 1970s and really used a lot with the Islamic issue in the 1990s up until the present. People keep saying that at the basis of the West is Judeo-Christianity. I wouldn't say that. I would say that it obviously is a really important component of the West, but before that, no one can deny that you have the Indo-European culture, you have the hunting, gathering, evolving white culture in Europe, and then you have the Greeks and the Romans.
This reminds me of the perspective of Peter Frost, one of the major writers at the Answer Review, who proposes that Christianity, in a way, was already in line with the unique guild culture that Normandy possessed before it arrived on the European continent. That hunter-gatherers had already developed a certain level of individualistic, aristocratic egalitarianism to a certain extent before Christianity arrived. And this was a beautiful match, so to say. It's one of his theses.
Yeah, that's right. They had already genetically developed into Europeans, as I argue in one chapter in Uniqueness, and they had also had this Indo-European experience of developing an aristocratic barbarian culture. So that's there. It is interesting to try and understand why it is that Christians themselves came to really appreciate the Greco-Roman tradition, that despite the fact that there were many that rejected paganism and they really wanted to convert them into Christianity, and they were very determined to do that and use violence. Like, you have Charlemagne, who in a violent militaristic way, whenever he defeats the pagan Germanic peoples, he imposes Christianity on them. But there is also a sense in which they are barbarians themselves and pagans to begin with, and then there is a kind of synthesis of these traditions within Christianity.
All right. One thing that I take to be never noted when Christianity is thought about as a Semitic influence is that one historical fact, namely that Jewish Christianity failed within a century. Paul talks about it all the time, but it's done literally by the 200s. There are no, generally speaking, Christians in Jerusalem. That movement failed. 2, if Christianity is true, then Christ is God incarnate, and so I suspect that his divinity overrides his ethnic character, whatever it may be.
Yes, another way to look at this is what happens to the Judaic tradition when it goes its own way. It develops in the Talmudic tradition, and they define themselves as separate and different from the Christian tradition. And to the degree to which they define themselves that way, they're outside the Western tradition. So Judaism on its own is not part of the West, even if Jews were existing within the West by their own criteria, by their own decision. And so Christians recognized and appreciated the Old Testament as an integral component of Christianity, but it was a component, not something that you could take it on its own, whereas the Jewish people took it by itself and remained separate from the Christian world.
After you finished with Faustian Man, you've begun to write, I think more politically, certainly your next book, which it hasn't been released yet, is that correct?
The last book, yeah, it was released.
Oh, just now? When did it come out?
It came out last week. It says August 7, the hardcover, but there was a recall. So I would say that it came out last week, and you can check it in Amazon. And actually, it is in Canada, in Amazon Canada. It is doing very well. It is the top. Both the softcover and the hardcover are 1 and 2 in the top new books in Canada.
The Kindle edition?
There is no Kindle edition yet.
Okay. Well, that's the Canada in Decay, Mass Immigration, Diversity and Ethnocide of Euro-Canadians, if I recall.
Right.
What, since we're doing the introductory aspect of this talk, what would you say your transition from Faustian Man and your work on history to this more modern political work would amount to?
Well, in a way, they were both done simultaneously. I was writing aspects of the Canada in Decay and Faustian Man at the same time. Through my blog, I had sort of first draft versions of various sections of these books. And so I was thinking about both of them. And the reason that I began to concentrate on Canada is because I am in Canada, and because ultimately, if we are going to address the question that I wanted to address in Faustian Man, which is not just the racial aspect of the West, but the decline of the West, then we have to address the issue of mass immigration and diversification. Because my view is that this is something that I began to really distinguish after Uniqueness. And it is that Western civilization is not just simply about values that are universal for humanity. This is what the conservatives argue, that the West developed these values like the right to vote, separation of church and state, equal rights, tolerance, and they include diversity too. They say, you know, that's what the West is about. We are a civilization that looks at human beings regardless of race, and therefore anybody can become Western. You just bring them in and they assimilate to these universal Western values. So I realized this view was wrong, that the West, there is so much more to it than this notion of universal values, and that you had to address this issue of mass immigration and the way in which it is going to lead to the eventual disappearance of Western civilization. Now, the issue of universality is an incredibly complex issue, because while on the one hand, I don't think that you can speak of the West as generating values that are true for humanity. Nevertheless, the West is the only civilization to have developed ways of thinking that have a universal quality to them. I mean,
Well,
you just have.
how do you mean? I mean, for instance, I mean, I could say it simply and I can say it more complicatedly. I mean, do you not consider thou shalt not murder, for instance, to be universal for all mankind? Or, I mean, to put it maybe in the Christian tradition, it's contrary to the natural law that one should act in such a way as to murder people, that is to say, kill innocent people.
Yes, I mean, they talk about common values. That's the foundation or the point from which a lot of people want to say, oh, well, when it comes down to it, even Obama will say, we all want the same thing. We want a peaceful society. We want comfort. We want prosperity and tolerance. And these things are things that all human beings want. If you give them a chance to aspire towards these things, they will aspire towards freedom of the press and so on. So they will argue that these values of the West are universal. There are things that human beings aspire to. Now, I don't think that is quite true. Historically, we know that these liberal democratic values only emerged in the West. So we have to pay attention to that. Why did they not emerge elsewhere? But as I just said, at the same time, there is a sense in which Western peoples have a universal quality to them within their own culture. So you take science. In the case of science, it's even beyond their own culture, because many other civilizations have assimilated modern science and they practice it. And everyone now, when they talk about science, they mean the same type of science across borders. Then you can look at the Roman legal tradition when they begin to talk about individuals engaging in contractual relations, and each individual is responsible or should be taken as an agent in legal situations. And the law is written in such a way or in a language that applies to everyone, regardless of their tribal background, regardless of where they were in Rome. So when Roman law was applied, it was not applied just for Romans themselves. At first, yes, but eventually it was meant to be for all Romans, regardless of where they were located and regardless of their ethnic background. So you can argue that in that sense, is universal, and it can be extended to everyone. And this is the basis out of which conservatives make their argument. But what I reply to that is that first, all these things came out of Europe. Secondly, we know that in many civilizations that are not European in the world, they don't really practice many things that Westerns practice. I mean, they were compelled, some of them just did it on their own, to have governments that were democratic. They have now free presses in Japan, and they have modern legal systems, if you like. They have modern science. So it looks like they are westernized. But there is more to the West than that. There are a whole range of other personal characteristics, things that relate to individuality, mannerisms. They never really have assimilated Western ways. I mean, to some degree, yes. In literature, they started imitating the way in which Westerners write novels, but they're just imitating these things, and most of the creativity in literature is still coming out of the West. And then in painting and art, not quite. It's still very unique to the West, but you cannot deny there is a process of convergence, a process of imitation by other civilizations of Western ways, and that to some degree they have become Westernized. Although I agree with Samuel Huntington that a lot of this should be defined as modernization rather than Westernization. So you can see me just talking here is a very complicated discussion that you cannot just run up in a few minutes.
No, I understand, of course. Well, here's a thought, because this is sort of a question about universalism. Would it be right to say, for instance, that you're skeptical of human nature in general, or that perhaps you believe that there's something like a human nature in general, but that you think that the West has some extras that it would be wrong to import onto humanity in general? For instance, as you said, Western liberal democracy, that doesn't seem to be something shared by human nature in general, but a local development.
Yes, I mean, we know that there are many common genetic characteristics across humans in the world. So the people who talk about human nature, they are right, like E.O. Wilson, and who is that other guy that wrote the book, The Blank Slate, recently, the American?
Steven Pinker.
Yes, these people are right that there is this common genetic nature across the world. But I think that there are differences in the nature of Europeans, Asians, mestizos, and blacks. And they're not just IQ differences, they are personality differences. And the word Faustian is meant to elucidate that, but it is very general. What I'm saying about Faustian man, or what Spengler says in a very sophisticated way about Faustian man, people with a scientific orientation are not going to be satisfied. But I think Spengler was onto something when he said that there was something peculiar and different about the European personality. He never talked about IQ. He was talking about other personality traits. So in that sense, you could say that the European human nature is different from that of other cultures.
I might add to this that genetics departments are increasingly showing us that these assertions that you're proposing right now are in a way backed up by the data. We do have indeed drastic genetic differences in temperament between Eastern and Westerners. I mean, for example, one particular allele that has become quite famous is 5-HT by now. It is showing that East Asians seem to be more. They are specifically coding for specific behavior patterns and temperamental inclinations that differ in the frequency between Westerners and Easterners. Even between Western and Eastern Europe, for example. Eastern Europeans are not Western Europeans.
Right. I mean, I was in Japan, and you see a modern society. You see a lot of people say that's Westernization. but they are different. Just the way they talk to each other. For example, academics expect a lot of deference from their inferiors. They see them as inferiors in the professional sense, and they are not able to talk as freely as students do in the Western world. They are not inclined to engage in questioning even when they become professors. Many of them are very, very surprised by the way in which in the Western world there's so much debate, so much discussion and exchanges between people. When you go to the Asian world, this is all new to them. They have never witnessed a situation in which individuals go their own way, argue against existing, get educated, and to get the proper degrees, and then you can take their views seriously. But students do it, and then when you become a person with a certain status, it is so common for people to challenge existing interpretations on all kinds of. When you see on every question, what brought the origins of the First World War, the Second World War, what was the Reformation about, what was the Renaissance about? I mean, there is so much difference in my view, and one of the things I'm going to do in my fourth book is that I'm going to really investigate even more the uniqueness of the West. People don't realize that every single discipline that you see being taught in our universities, biology, geology, geography, chemistry, all of them were created in the Western world. And they're all products of the incredibly inquisitive mind and persistence of Western peoples to reveal the nature of the world. And that's part of what I mean also by universality. It's a kind of universality that is not what the conservatives mean, but it's almost like they want to understand the world as it is. And if you try to understand the geography of the world and then you map the world, so we have a cartographic revolution in Europe in the 16th century, then other people can say, yeah, I mean, that's the way the geography of the world looks, but it all came out of the European world. And then this is happening in astronomy, it's happening in physics, and some of them can join in, but most of the creativity to this day is really coming out of the West. So it's as if they have this mandate, they have been chosen to find out the secrets and the meaning and the laws of the whole universe. And they keep persistent with this. And as they do this, they are debating a lot between themselves, and they're generating all kinds of philosophies. I mean, it's very hard when you're a philosophy student and you read the history of philosophies in the West to really know which one to believe in. I mean, you have Hume and then Locke, and the empiricists don't agree with each other, and then you have the rationalists, and then you have many other people that come thereafter, and later on you have the Romantic Revolution and the German idealist philosophical revolution, and each of them is different. Schelling belongs to the same generation as Hegel, and they're friends, but then they really disagree and they go their own way. And then after that, you have Nietzsche, so different from all of them, and Heidegger, and so on. So this is very unique, and that's what I mean by uniqueness.
What I wanted to transition to, especially on the back of your upcoming book, is the situation that academia has put itself in, I suppose, methodologically. Obviously, the political position that you're having to deal with in your activism, but also that you're having to deal with even in your scholarship, is ideological in character. What would you say that certainly, and we can start with history, but you can certainly look at multiculturalism in general. How would you characterize the multiculturalist ideology that you're dealing with in academia? What are its core commitments? What are its core confinements, as it were?
Well, in the book that just came out on Canada, in the fourth part, I think, I tried to explain how did it all come about that Western societies decided to become multicultural and open their borders to everyone else. this conservative notion of universalism has something to do with it, but there is a lot more to it. And I'm not going to go over the explanation now, but I will say this, that multiculturalism aims at eliminating that which makes the West different, in part because they don't think that the West really ultimately is that different. And then there are others that really dislike what makes the West different. They identify the West with the slave trade, imperialism, arrogance, and they just want to get rid of that and create a situation in which all peoples get together and they're in a harmonious state of existence and we learn from each other and so on. I'm really against that because it will dilute and eventually kill off what makes the West different. I mean, you can argue against it in the name of the cultural determination of all peoples, and that's a good argument. In other words, you want Tibetans to remain Tibetans and not be absorbed by the Chinese. You like the fact that Japan has its own unique culture and so on across the world. And so you said the same thing about the various European nations. But I also think that there are people that really resent the way in which the West went ahead. They don't like it. It just doesn't sit well with them. And the West has to be responsible in large measure for this as well, because the West generated this notion of equality, which was taken eventually to mean that we must equalize everything. And so if the West stands out, it's like, oh, that's not fair, that shouldn't be allowed. That's because they're exploiting someone else, or they're not playing, in a fair way. So you have to push them back down and then equalize everyone. So, I mean, I am, in a sense, Nietzschean about this whole thing, which is that if affirmation of Western identity means striving to the point to which they actually do make most of the discoveries and rise above everyone else, well, that's just the way it is, because other peoples can do that. Other people can do that, and that's just in their own nature as well. I mean, the Japanese, you can see it when the Japanese really decide to modernize, is because they respect what's going on in the West. They can't believe that they were so advanced, and they feel we need to return our identity, but also we need to show the world that we are a people and that we do we value ourselves. So they go into this manic industrialization drive to assert themselves in the world. So this is just, to me, part of the way of things. And the Chinese are doing that today, and other peoples do it to the degree to which they can and they want. Whereas the West is sort of doesn't want to play that game. I mean, in economics, yes, the Western world or Western business people, they want to be successful in their businesses. And if the business is owned by Europeans, they don't care, they just want to be successful. But still, there's no question that they are globalists. They want to integrate other peoples, and they want to ultimately say that, this is part of a whole world civilization. It's nothing unique to the West. Whereas I like to keep it unique to the West.
Well, Professor, we will return to the question of self-assertion and Western self-assertion later on, but what I was more driving at, specifically since you're a professor of history, is a question more like this. If you want to be an orthodox historian, non-controversial in academia, what specifically are the requirements for reading texts that will be imposed upon you?
It depends. I mean, you still have serious, very good historians in the Western world writing about all sorts of subjects which are not directly political. So you still have that going on. But there is this umbrella, this atmosphere in the whole Western academic world, which compels everyone to be politically correct and not to sound the way I just sound, not to be too pro-Western, not to differentiate peoples in the world, because they're fearful of that. They're fearful of the fact that you're going to say Europeans achieve a lot more than Africans. They're going to say that's not acceptable. If you have a classroom of diverse students from all areas of the world, they should all feel included. And so you don't highlight the West. It's just not right. And even if they agree with what I'm saying, they don't want to do that. They're nervous. They're afraid to do that. And that's kind of really is the atmosphere. And when people assert the West, they do so in the conservative way. They say, "Oh no, this civilization that we admire is for everyone, and you should embrace it because you yourself want liberal values and you want modern science. So it's just for everyone, and everyone is welcome here." And that's what the West is about. But to me, that eventually will dilute and really bring down Western civilization.
Well, the ideological situation in academia is obvious. It was obvious to me 10 years when I was considering becoming a professor. It's obvious today even more so. It was obvious 20 years ago. But the more specific question that was interesting to me was the question of particular methodologies, particularly in uniqueness you emphasized. I know, for instance, you were personally familiar and trained in the History from Below school. You know, you talk about world systems theory, if I recall the name correctly, which I'm vaguely familiar with. It had a small amount of impact on philosophy, but obviously much larger in history. It seems to me, at least tacitly, like methodologies like these are systematically designed, if not to be directly multicultural, then at least to be helpful to somebody who wants to be ideologically multicultural and to stack the deck against anyone who wants to assert the uniqueness of the West. Do you agree with that? And if so, what are the sort of common aspects of these methodologies that do this?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you see a whole range of different schools and methodologies emerging after the Second World War. When people talk about cultural Marxism, they concentrate on the Frankfurt School, which, yes, you can identify as being very important.
Gramsci, for instance.
Yeah, Gramsci and the Adorno and Marcuse.
Yeah.
Right. But this is one school among many others. You mentioned the History from Below. There is the Fernand Braudel School. There is the quantitative historians. There is feminism. There is race critical theory, a whole range of them. And there is something common about them in that they're all trying to go against what makes the West stand out. And they do it in various ways. If you take History from Below, it's not that they did not make great contributions. There is no question that when you look at the French Revolution, it would be a mistake to think that it was a revolution that was made by the bourgeoisie against the nobility. We know that the peasantry and the sans-culottes, or the people who work in small workshops, that they play a very significant role. But what's going on ordinary people, the masses, people who were exploited and are exploited, on women, on minorities, and on quantitative history that measures quantities, large numbers, and that when they concentrate on that, you are taking away what makes the West different, because what makes the West different is always what the elites do. If you look at the scientific revolution, it's driven by elites, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment. So you're really taking away Western uniqueness. And in Western academia, they think that they're being democratic and open when they just talk about masses of people and include them all into the narrative, and they talk about the indigenous peoples and so on. And I'm fine, you can write about all that stuff, but you are going to miss that which makes the West unique, and you're going to miss really the big essential transformations of the West. So I think Nietzsche in this respect was right, that you're not going to get to the essentials of history if you leave out the great individuals, the great philosophers, the great artists, because ordinary people don't produce great art, they don't produce great music. Even though this is not to denigrate them or anything like that, you can argue that they do deserve to have rights. But if you're a student and you want to know about great art, well, you're not going to study the art of ordinary people because you're not going to really learn much about art. The same with music. So you have to concentrate on the elites, and it is at that level that the West is different, not at the level of ordinary life. So universities have been concentrating a lot on that which is plain and common.
As a fellow ex-Marxist, how long would you say you were attracted to Marxism as a methodological approach in history?
Well, for a long time. I mean, more or less from the moment I got out of high school right through into my PhD. I have lots of books by Marxists. I wanted to be the best Marxiologist I could be. I would read all of Marx right from his very early writings and meticulously take notes about it. And Lenin, I mean, I love Lenin. I just read actually about in June.
So you were sort of more the traditional school rather than, say, the post-Gramsci cultural school, or that as well.
Yeah, no, I read Gramsci. I really like Gramsci. I like Althusser, Louis Althusser, and the whole New Left school of Marxists centered around New Left Review, Petty Anderson, and Poulantzas, the Greek. So I read all these people, and I really liked them. I never really liked the postmodernists. I began to react against
Derrida, Foucault, and
yeah, like I read a bit by them and about them.
For the audience, by the way, most people don't understand that to anyone who's ever been a former Marxist, Foucault and Derrida and most of the French theorists are obviously post-Marxists of different kinds.
Right. You can call them cultural Marxists, but they're not strictly speaking Marxists in the classical sense, the postmodernists.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was skeptical of them, and they were very prominent when I was doing my PhD in the Department of Social and Political Thought. I kind of prefer just your standard philosophers of the past, Hegel and the modern philosophers. I felt I didn't know them, and why would I be reading all these people now when most of the people that we're talking about, including Heidegger and Derrida, they didn't really know the ancient Greeks and that, and they were just they sounded very confused and confusing to me when I heard them talk.
The point was sort of more to what I've noticed, either tacitly. I don't know how aware historians generally are of their philosophical background, but what I've noticed, as you talk about multicultural historical schools, and some non-multicultural historical schools as well, is a focus on what a Marxist would call materialism, which of course isn't classical materialism per se, which is just the commitment that everything is matter, and then the question is what's matter exactly, but materialism of a specific sort. For traditional Marxism, it would be economic materialism, but certainly this gets more complicated by the time you get to the 20th century. Do you think, one, that this commitment to, well, first, what would materialism be here in the discipline of history? And do you think that it is a pervasive aspect of much of the way history is done today?
I mean, it's difficult to answer because there are many types of historians depending on the subject. I myself, I'm not against materialism. I think that if you want to understand history, you have to look at geographical conditions in a way that...
Well, but I take it that materialism is reductive. That is to say, Marx always says just outright, it is the conditions of production, and nothing else. That's his denial of Hegel, that it could be anything other than the conditions of production.
Yeah, then at that point, I rejected and find limitations. So when I do the Europeans, I identify them at first in a materialistic way. I talk about the way in which they domesticated horses. I talk about the secondary revolutions. I forget, there's a word that I'm missing, but it has to do,
secondary products revolutions.
right. It has to do with the full exploitation of animals.
Milk,
And
wool, etc.
yeah, and there were many other things that identify them in materialistic terms. But then I moved into their aristocratic spirit, which I think was fundamentally spiritual. It was in many ways an attempt to negate the way in which the material world should rule over you and your biology. And you see this in Plato, in Greek philosophy, that they're reacting against that. So yeah, I have never been of the view that one excludes the other. It's just knowing what the limitations of the materialist view are, and then knowing at what point do you allow for the full play of the spiritual side of human beings, and that side cannot be reduced to materialistic forces, because in many ways it's a conscious negation of it. When aristocratic warriors would seek to perform great heroic deeds, they would do so as individuals against their strongest survival instincts. So when you read someone like
You mean this is what you call the fight for pure prestige, the Hegelian fight for pure prestige, or recognition, as some others call it.
like if you read Thomas Hobbes, he says the most fundamental instinct of human beings is survival. And he said the reason why human beings let go of the liberties they enjoy in the state of nature is that they want to enjoy security because they're afraid of death. So they agree to allow themselves to be ruled by a powerful ruler that will then give them security. And so Hobbes captures, no question, a fundamental instinct among human beings for survival. But when you study the aristocratic culture of Indo-Europeans, that's not how they're thinking. They are, as individuals, they think it would be shameful for them to give in to that survival instinct. That honor requires them to fight for something higher and to live limited, short lives, if need be, for the sake of achieving recognition by others. So this is not a materialistic pursuit. When you're seeking recognitions from your peers within this small aristocratic community, you're seeking something that is immaterial. You just want your peers to say, oh, wow, like that was really something what you just did there. You were so unafraid, and you really fought back, and you didn't mind that you would lose your life.
Numerous accounts in all of the ancient Greek myths and stories of people who choose to survive being they're cowards and worthless. They have no honor, no virtue. So you would say that you're not a reductive materialist in any sense. But you of course would be absurd to say that economics doesn't matter, which of course I think almost everybody would, or genetics doesn't matter, for instance. But you, of course, what you're saying is that you think that there, certainly in history, is an important spiritual component. And of course you just characterized it in terms of the history of the West as a kind of fight for recognition, a fight for pure prestige in the eyes of others, which is not a purely material activity. Is there more you would characterize the spiritual side of man as?
Is there more to it than just that?
Than just the fight for pure prestige? I mean,
oh yes,
we needn't go too far into the immateriality of mind, but I mean, it would be interesting to look at it from the perspective of a historian.
Right. That fight for prestige is there at the basis of the prehistory of the West, but it then gets civilized, and you have to follow that through in the ancient Greek intellectual accomplishments. So when you look at the Greek art and you look at Greek philosophy and so on, you do see there spiritual creations. There's just no way around that. The materialistic explanation, even if you manage to reduce it, it's like, so what? So you've managed to locate certain cells within the brain that correspond to this artistic creation, but it just doesn't explain the art in its own terms and doesn't really say
to
anything.
put it in a pithy way, the Parthenon isn't, say, the structure of the Greek brain plus economic conditions. It's not the
Right.
cost of the wood and the stone and some gray matter.
No, it just doesn't. So you have to understand what was behind this architecture. Why is it so? I mean, why do they have their own unique sculptures? And to really understand that, you have to get into the Greek spirit. There's no way around that. The same thing with Plato. I mean, Plato is saying it to you right there that he himself believed that striving for knowledge is getting away from all these sensory influences and going upwards into a world of that is strictly spiritual. You don't have to agree with him, but his way of thinking, his whole writing is not reducible to material factors.
Yeah. To put it in a pithy way, the Parthenon isn't, say, the structure of the Greek brain plus economic conditions. It's not the cost of the wood and the stone and some gray matter. Jim Penman says that you were very influential and helpful in the development of his theory of biohistory. I take it you're familiar with his book?
Right. He contacted me, and then we agreed that I would work with him in trying to add historical context to his arguments.
We've read Penman's book, and we very much hope to have him on in the future. But I mention it by means of transition on this point. Penman obviously has a genetic and, although mostly epigenetic, account of the cycles of civilization, which would in a sense be material. How do you think, sort of in view of what Penman thinks, how do you think we should consider the relation of the spiritual and the biological?
Yeah, Penman is, to use your word, he's a reductionist.
Well, he says he's not. I take it because he's a Christian. He can't, in principle, be.
Right. So they kind of, but his understanding of religion and Christianity is very materialistic. So I mean, I'm not going to try and explain why he is a Christian, other than to say that if you look at his theory, the way he looks at religion is not really about whether God exists or not. You don't even have to worry about that to understand the role that religion plays in his theory. And the role that it plays, and I think he is onto something, is that it simply increases and solidifies certain behaviors that he calls C behaviors that are associated with the possibility of creating a civilization. So if you're going to have hunters and gatherers and get them to behave as farmers, then in his view, religion plays a big role in instilling upon humans the behaviors that are necessary for an agrarian society. And he calls them C behaviors. And these behaviors have to do with controlling your sex drive, getting married and being monogamous, raising your children to also be the same way in controlling their sex drive, and having work habits as a farmer, because being a farmer is a very difficult thing. I mean, we know that hunters and gatherers, when they were given the option to be farmers, they knew about the technology that was required to do farming, but they didn't want to do it because it's very hard. You have to do all kinds of tasks, clear the land, and then wash over it and fence it and take the weed out and keep away water that is too excessive, and all kinds of things you have to do. So human beings by nature don't want to work hard. They like to, the primitive affluent society was that guy. He developed a famous thesis that primitive peoples were the first affluent people because he observed that they would work 4 to 5 hours per day, and that was enough, and then they just relax and take it easy the rest of the day. So to get human beings who prefer this affluent primitive lifestyle, to get them to become farmers and start working hard and every day, according to Payman, you have to increase their C behaviors, and religion, Christianity play a big role later on in the case of Christianity, because there were other religions before Christianity, but religion plays a big role in instilling upon humans high C behaviors. But that's a whole different conversation. We want to get into that.
Of course. I don't expect you to defend Penman's thesis in particular, but it is the question of the relationship of the spirit to the biological that I'm trying to flag here. Because I, of course, have no problem thinking, for instance, that low V, which is probably correlated to, among other things, low testosterone, low vigor, but other things as well, has a cultural effect. I mean, frankly speaking, if you have no get up and go, you're not going to build the Parthenon, obviously. But it is the question of whether or not, well, we've already denied reductionism, but it is the question of how should we think of the relationship of your diet and your spiritual life? Should we think of them, because the trap for at least 300 or 400 or 500 years is to try to make one or the other the whole thing, to try to make one or the other dominate the other thing, to try to make the mind disappear, to try to make the material disappear. And how do we avoid this? I mean, in your own academic writing, for instance, how do you avoid it other than to just flag both things?
I think my tendency is to acknowledge the veracity of both sides and give them their respective places and moments. Even Hegel, when you read Hegel, he's not against materialism. Hegel starts his philosophy of history, he starts it with geography, and he actually says that Europeans were different to start with because of the geographical location of Europe and the climate and so on. So he recognizes that, and I don't see any problem with that and how that is inconsistent with his idealism. So I mean, I used to get into those debates, which is first and so on. And as a Marxist, I was a materialist, and matter was first. And you could argue that yes, physics and then chemistry and biology are first, although we don't know what led to the whole thing to start with, and it looks like we will never know. So we will never know if matter is first or spirit. I tend to think that it cannot just be matter defined as something that is without order or reason or purpose or energy. It just seems not to make sense, but we don't know.
Oh, you think it's impossible to have metaphysical arguments demonstrating that? For instance, the incoherence of materialism?
Yeah, no, I just mean that if you're looking at the ultimate origin of all things, a physicist would get into the ultimate law of physics and reduce the four laws to one law and then try and make a materialistic argument. But my view is that that's impossible. No matter right, no matter how close it gets to the very first instant of the beginning of the universe, he will never know or can never explain it in physical terms. He just doesn't hit it right at the beginning. And he doesn't know why it all happened and what for. So that question is beyond physics.
Well, I mean, in principle, when we work on this question of scientism, and we've done a lot of reading, it's
and
not
yet
even
physics
so much.
teaches you a lot, right?
Well, of course. But it's not even so much that the physical scientist doesn't know, that is to say that he has some kind of explanatory gap. It's that he, in principle, always starts with a methodology that only looks at physical quantitative things.
Right.
And then to ask the question, sort of, where is the spiritual thing, when that's the methodology, is much like asking the question, where are the wooden things, when the only sensory device you have is a metal detector. Well, of course, if you only look at reality with a metal detector, you're only going to get metal things. And it would be so bizarre to conclude, therefore, that there are no wooden things.
Yeah, that happens to quantitative historians. They say, look, we need to be precise, give us numbers, give us statistics, but they don't realize that only material things can be quantified. And the moment you say that, you are limiting yourself to explaining only things that can be quantified. And so in a way, that's not fair to the other side, because art, philosophy, and so on cannot be quantified.
I suppose in the case of quantitative physics, the argument in favor of quantitative physics has always been that it produces repeatable, useful technological results. Of course, this doesn't demonstrate that there are only quantifiable things, but in any case, I wonder, has quantitative history had such a record of successes, or are they merely aping chemistry and biology and physics in their quantitative method?
Well, they have success in the sense that they're going to give you a lot of precise statements about population growth, say in France, the birth rate versus the fertility rate. They can tell you a whole range of things about how much grain was consumed, or what was the agricultural productivity per person at this time, more or less the degree to which society was marketized. They can give you a lot of precise information about these things, but again, it's about things that can be quantified. And when they get to the intellectual world, they can also give you very good information. So for example, let's say you want to know the extent to which Europe was an educated, enlightened society, you can look about how many books were produced or published in France during this period. And that can tell you a lot. And you can compare how many books with different titles were published in England in the 18th century, and compare them to how many books were published in another society, and then make all kinds of conclusions about that. But you're going to miss out on the contents of the book. You're not going to be able to say much about exactly what Hume said in his book on human nature. So it's one of those things that, as you just said, you can quantify things, but there are many things that are not quantifiable, or quantifying them doesn't really tell you much about them.
For the last aspect of this exploration, the historical methodology, I wanted to ask you about historical revisionism. It's very obvious that world history as a field is strongly ensconced in a kind of historical revisionism. Certainly, as it appears in cultural studies fields, black studies, wherein they, for instance, will conclude that, Egypt was essentially a black nation, or in some sense influenced black history, essentially, of course, is a vulgar version. In its more complete picture, world history as a field seems to amount to a, as you say, a diminishment and displacement of the West in the narrative, rather than sort of a demonstration of its actual lack of importance. Of course, we have this on the right as well, with both pagan historical revisionism, World War II revisionism of various sorts. One would hesitate not to call this personal or in-group propaganda. Do you think that it is outside of the function of history to serve as a propagandistic tool?
Well, what has happened in history is that revisionism is out of control. Revisionism is valid, I mean, because that is actually part of the Western disposition. We don't want to accept a historical interpretation just because it gains authority and many people accepted it. You may have discovered new documents, thought about the issue in a different way, and then you propose a new interpretation, and then it is called revisionist if it goes against the standing interpretation. There is nothing wrong with revisionism, but since the Second World War, it has gotten out of control, and now they have revised everything. And one of the things that I show in this, I show this in Uniqueness, as you know, but in this last book on Canada, I show that in the case of Canadian history, and this is happening across the board with respect to the history of all European nations, what they're doing is that they are revising the history of all these nations in such a way that it fits in with the diversification of those nations. And the way you do that, the main way, is that you argue that Canada was from the very beginning a nation of diverse immigrants. that what is happening today is a continuation of things that were happening in the past. The difference, they argue, is that in the past, white Canadians ignore the history of these other minorities. They suppressed it, and they created the mythology that Canada was a white nation. So they argue, no, it was not. There were blacks, there were natives, and there were peoples from all sorts of places in the world, Chinese. Now, there is just now a book came out by a Chinese in Canada who says that the Chinese people are a founding peoples of Canada just because they build a few tracks of railway. So they're making all kinds of revisionist arguments. They're doing this in England as well. It's not just Canada. So what I argue in this book on Canada is that I say this is totally untrue. Is a falsification of the historical record, and it's a violation of the historical profession. There is no doubt that Canada was created by people from an Anglo French heritage, that most of them were actually born in Canada. They were not immigrants. There was a very high fertility rate among the few immigrants that came in, that they were not really immigrants. They were first pioneers, and then they were settlers. And if you look at the dictionary definition of settler before immigrant, it's very different. But they eliminated that. They argue, no, everybody's an immigrant, just like immigrants today, and you whites are just immigrants. And they brainwash the hell out of everybody in Australia, in New Zealand, in England, with this idea. So that's a form of historical revisionism that is false and goes against what the historical profession should be about.
I wanted to transition over to a set of discussions about colonialism and your Latin American background. For instance, when I was doing the research, I found that a man of unknown identity, a Marxist critic of you, says in his blog that he was born and raised in Puerto Rico. Apparently, the colonial condition was insufficient to keep his head screwed on right. To correct the record, what is the influence of your Latin American background on your work?
Well, I guess to get a full answer, you have to get into my own family history beyond the Latin American background. But let's just stick to the Latin American background and the influence it may have had. I had been absent from Puerto Rico for over, like, when was the last time? I was there in 1987, and last year in 2015 I went back. So you can count the years there. That's a long time. And when I went back, you know, people said, oh, you may have to rediscover your roots, and like you now realize that maybe diversity is good and all this nonsense. And I said, no, actually it had the opposite effect. It made me realize that the Puerto Rican people have a strong sense of identity, that it is true there are racially mixed people, but the diversity you see in Puerto Rico was not a program. It just happened. Nobody planned it. It wasn't superimposed from above. Just various people from various races converged on that island. And they actually have a more healthy relationship between the races. So if you watch TV, you tend to see a lot more whites on television, and nobody complains about that. And even the non-whites kind of take it like, yeah, that's what whites do, or maybe that's just the way things are. We are good in other things. We're better maybe in baseball or something else. So I think they have a healthier attitude. You don't have the hysteria you have in the United States. And then another thing is that
It would be worth noting that this was roughly the attitude in the until about the 1980s in United States television.
Right. And another thing is that how would Puerto Ricans feel if the government decided that their history was bad, that it had to be condemned for whatever crimes they committed, and they're going to be culturally enriched by bringing Koreans and Filipinos and Norwegians, and this is just going to be great for Puerto Ricans because we really are not that good. We have always been racist, and these people are just better and are going to make us better. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. And yeah, this is accepted in all European nations. So it actually made me realize, even in a stronger way, that as a person that does have roots in Puerto Rico, I do believe in the national and cultural integrity of nations, and that's part of the argument I'm making in favor of Europeans.
I wanted to ask you more about Latin America. I take it you speak Spanish fluently as a first language. You obliquely talked about the condition of Latin America in some of your books. I think you say something along the lines of Latin America is a sort of on the way to modernization. And of course, we know genetically that the admixture of Europeans into South America and Central America and the Caribbean is significant. Usually no less than 20% in the mestizo population, and often significantly much higher. So what do you think about the status of Latin America as both in general culturally and as a quasi-European region? I mean, it's Catholic, at least partially genetically European. Would you want to consider it European or non-European or something in between?
It's something in between, and it depends from nation to nation. If you look at Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, you have a situation in which the native and the mestizo population is really mostly the whole population, and it becomes difficult in that situation to call them Western, even if they are Christian. So you can see there that the issue of Christianity on its own doesn't make a country Western, or the presence of Christianity, but there are other places in Latin America, even within the same country, like you take Brazil, for example. There are some states within Brazil, regions, they have their own name, and they're overwhelmingly white. Now, the word white is used differently in Latin America than in the United States. They have more leeway, right? So you never know how white they are. But I would say that...
Would you say it's mostly an appearance adjective or a background adjective, or how is it usually employed?
It's used in a looser way, that you can be slightly brownish and you can be considered white, but sometimes that has to do just with the sun, and the features are very white, but they're slightly brownish because of generations of living in a hotter climate.
Well, the Spaniards were already generally more darker than the rest of Europeans.
Right. But they also are a bit looser. Like if they know you have some non-white blood, but you kind of look white, they'll still say white. In the case of Brazil, it depends, because you have some regions there that are very Germanic European, and they are really going to be white. And my point is that there are regions of Brazil that, when you look at Wikipedia, what it says about them, they're in the 90%, very high 80 some region, and some 90 something percent white. So you have this situation, and these states in Brazil that happen to be whiter happen to be the most functional ones, the least levels of crime, of corruption. Wikipedia says it straight out. They don't say, oh, it's because they're white. They just happen to tell you the information. I forget now the states. I was looking at this a few months ago, that according to many indicators, economic and social indicators, they are the best areas of Brazil. So you can see right there in Latin America this dynamic, this racial dynamic that bespeaks of what may happen in Europe and is already happening in the United States.
Would you say that the indigenous peoples of Latin America and perhaps the mestizos have their own culture at all, or are or do they have some sort of dependent relationship on the cultures surrounding them?
No, I mean, there are areas like in Ecuador and Bolivia, whole big areas that are really indigenous with very much their own lifestyle. And the Christianity that they have is intermixed with all their religious beliefs and customs. And it's very hard to call them or identify them as Western. The only place you can sort of say is quasi-Western is the city, and even then it's difficult. So yeah, you have a situation like that in Latin America, all kinds of different regions with very different characteristics.
What are you about the strongly intermixed mestizo contingent? Do you think they have a particular character of their own, or do you think they choose sides, or how do you think it works?
Well, the mestizo, it depends, because there are all kinds of gradations, and Latin Americans are very aware of it, and they have all kinds of names, so that if you're closer to the indigenous in terms of blood, you have a different name, and then if you move up the ranking and you're kind of a bit more mixed with white, then there's another term to identify you, all the way up to the ones that are really like a lot more white, and they're at the very top, and they really remain the ruling elite. But there is no doubt that within the ruling elite, you do have mestizos now as well.
I asked the question partially to consider the situation of mass immigration into the United States. Mass immigration into the United States has largely been mestizo, Latin Americans specifically, or generally from Mexico, though not only. One of the concern, and this is of course very different from the European situation, which has been largely Middle Easterners, with some others, Africans and others. Is there, or do you cite the possibility of any level of mestizo integration into the European culture of the United States, or do you think factionalism is the most likely result?
It really comes down to numbers. If you have low numbers of mestizo immigration to the United States, they could integrate into the United States. It's just that the numbers are consistently high, and anyone who goes to the Mexican areas in the United States knows that they are Mexican.
You don't think they have the temperamental proclivity to enter into Anglo-European culture in the United States?
They don't want to. The Mexicans are very nationalistic. They're known among Latin Americans to be the most nationalistic. They love their flag.
Even second and third generation?
Well, it depends, again, in terms of numbers. Yeah. If you have small numbers, they will integrate. As it was the case when you look at the people who came in the 40s, 50s, they were kind of integrating. But now it's very hard to say that they have integrated. The other thing to understand is that the United States is not what it used to be. So when they integrate, they're not really integrating anymore to a so-called white nation. They're integrating to a diverse, multicultural, Marxist nation. So that's not real integration. I mean, that's just, yeah.
So you don't think this is merely a matter of temperamental difference between, say, mestizo populations and more traditional populations in the United States? You think this is also a matter of a cultural change that means that any temperamental commonality or any genetic commonality will be de-emphasized?
No, it's a matter of genetics as well, because obviously if you had a bunch of Germans, as you did in the past, coming in, they kind of integrated and became Americans, and then you don't really notice it. With the Mexicans, many of them will continue to talk Spanish. They're very determined to talk Spanish, and they develop their own communities, and they continue to be Mexicans as they were Mexicans in Mexico. So I have spoken to some people in Arizona, like there's a particular teacher that teaches high school, and he tells me, you know, most of my students are Mexican, and I can tell you they don't identify themselves as American. They really identify themselves as Mexican. So in that sense, clearly it has to do with their Mexican sense of identity and their racial identity. But they are saying now, well, that's what the United States is about. The fact that they identify themselves as Mexican is what it means to be an American. So then they could say, yeah, we are American. It just, we happen to believe that that's what it means to be American.
Do you think that their cultural forms are as different from the traditional American cultural forms as, say, the Middle Easterners are from the European cultural forms, or the East Asianers are from the European cultural forms, or do you think it's closer?
It's not as much, because in the case of the Muslims, they are in a state of intense animosity against the Western Christianity, and they do really want to create an Islamic state. Whereas in the case of the Mexicans, it's kind of just happens more naturally as a result of numbers, as a result of their language and their customs. It's not so much that they're politically directly engaged in countering American culture. It's more a matter of, we are mestizo Mexicans and we just remain who we are, and we are kind of quasi-separate. It's more that way. Whereas the Islamic is a direct antagonism and opposition to the society they're living in.
To transition out of the question about Latin America, I wanted to talk about the topic of common humanity. We did mention it briefly in the introductory remarks, but you make the claim that, for instance, in the Enlightenment, common humanity was very different than how we talk about it. I remember in an interview you said that if you went back and you read, say, Montesquieu or Kant, very famous Enlightenment thinkers on human nature, as it were, it turns out that they would be very racist to modernize and rank peoples in accords with their quality. Hegel does as well. I think, for instance, he characterizes the sub-Saharan Africans as perpetually asleep, or something along those lines. Sort of, what do you think that so we could start conceptually, what do you think that the Enlightenment concept of common humanity really amounted to?
Yeah, I wrote about this, and there is a particular article in which I examined this in more detail, but for some reason it has been stalled and not published. I don't know why, but Enlightenment thinkers, most of them, by our standards, were racist. They did come to the conclusion that we were all part of the same species, because there were some people that were talking about divergent evolutionary lines, and that idea was rejected by the majority, and they kind of came to the view that we were all human beings and had a common humanity in that respect. But they did made all kinds of anthropological observations. You see this in Kant, you see this in Linnaeus, I can't pronounce his name, but a French botanist, the one who classified all kinds of plants. And then there were many other Enlightenment thinkers that are well known who spoke of racial differences in ways that today, if they had been academics, they would all have been fired, including Kant. And Kant came to these views because he used to live in this port, was it Riga? It's like a port, and he would hear stories from all kinds of people that went on ships around the world, and he read some of their traveling accounts, and he did distinguish the Native Americans, the Africans, and other peoples from each other, and he ranked the Europeans at the top, and actually said that only Europeans are capable of, that they are kind of the highest expression of human evolution, capable of achieving perfection. And when you look at his what is this critique of pure reason, and he talks about the categories, and you read it in light of his anthropology, he's kind of saying that only the Europeans were able to develop these categories, that other races don't show any sign of them. So among philosophers, they always say that these categories exist innately among all human beings, and it is the way in which we structure the world of experience. We give it order with these concepts that are inherent to human beings about causality and so on. Well, he kind of says that these are only located within the structure of the European brain. Yeah, so in that sense, there is a racial component to his thinking that violates this notion that Kant was a cosmopolitan, because now Habermas and all these cosmopolitans, they want to act like Kant is the founder of the EU, and the EU wants to integrate all the races of the world inside Europe to fulfill Kant's dream. Well, he never ever said anything like that, and there's nowhere in his writings that you can find any justification for the EU as it has been conceived.
Yeah, the traditional Western line, and this is as old as at least Aristotle, although I think it was common thinking among many Greek intellectuals, is something along the lines of there is such a thing as human nature and there is such a thing as general law, but only civilization follows it. And among civilization is the Greeks and maybe a few others, and the rest are barbarians. Which is not to say that the barbarians would fulfill their natures by following civilization, but they can't for whatever reason.
Yeah, it is right there in the Greeks, or this distinction among the different cultures of the world is in Aristotle. It is in the guy that founded medicine, Hippocrates, and there are others. You see it in their writings. It was just natural and normal for people to make these kinds of observations and distinctions.
I wanted to talk about your view of pedagogy and the university. You say in a private statement that you uphold the traditional spirit of broad learning for undergraduate students. Would you say that you believe in great books, education programs, or do you support even more strident reforms of the structure of the university?
Yes, that's right. I tend to believe that reading good books is essential to an education, and that almost all the great books were published by Europeans. Therefore, you should concentrate on Western culture. And in fact, if it was up to me, I would structure the entire BA around Western civilization. So it would only be about the West. And then eventually you can start looking at other civilizations. After all, Europeans were the ones who wrote the history of other civilizations, who sought explanations of them, invented archaeology, anthropology, and just the whole profession of proper historical writing. So that's my view, that a student learns more by focusing on the West than they would learn by concentrating on the Americas or Africa. There's a lot less to be learned from these other cultures. And so if you want to enhance their education, you should concentrate on Europe. And that's the same with all this multicultural nonsense, is that they want to act like, oh, we're just being so cosmopolitan by bringing the whole world. We want to get away from the parochialism of Eurocentrism, but this is just nonsense, because cosmopolitanism is itself a creation of Europeans, and almost all the great thinkers come out of Europe, historical works, everything. So if you really seriously are dedicated to learning, then you might as well admit it and just concentrate on Europe.
We're going to conclude the main part of the interview, and now we're going to go over to the Q&A. We're going to start with Naked Ape's questions. Go ahead, Naked Ape.
Well, first, I'd like to say thank you for coming here, Professor. It's very interesting to see people of the right actively engaging with internet culture. I find that interesting that it's the new right that's doing this and trying to achieve this ends, and not the old right. Maybe it's because they are the old right. But my question deals more with metaphysics than with facts, and I'd like to briefly explain to people who will be listening for the recording, and perhaps do this to explain the question a little further. Hume's is-ought dichotomy is something that I feel that the alt-right and the new right in general have difficulties with bridging. I'd like to present to you a few facts, a few notions that IQ is real, that IQ is a heavy determiner of life success, that the G factor is real, and that IQ is determined in some small part by the biology of race. Now, you may think that anybody who believed this would be exiled from any intellectual community because of their racism, but this is a set of beliefs that are held by Sam Harris. So you may ask the question, how is it that somebody who is so obviously a utilitarian, so obviously a hyper-individualist, and so obviously a modern skeptic can hold these anti-individualist views and comport them to his politics? Well, I propose to you it is because he does not see these facts as having any moral input, because they are not related to him directly, because Hume's is-ought.
I mean, Jared Taylor, right? One of the arguments that he often makes is that those who denied racial differences, when they look at the actual differences in success between blacks and whites in the United States, they blame whites for the lack of success among blacks, and they say it is because of white racism and discrimination. So his argument is that if we want to get away from this kind of blaming, we have to recognize the reality of racial distinctions. And I think there is something to what he's saying. I don't see that as something that has to do with this human what is, what ought to be. He's not saying, in the case of Jared Taylor, he's not saying that because there is this racial distinction, then it follows that it ought to be this way. In the example that I just gave, he's actually saying that the other side is drawing an ought from their claim that there are no racial distinctions. They're blaming whites for the existing lack of success among blacks. So he just wants to say, look, if you want to explain that lack of success, then you might want to look at IQ and stop blaming whites for it.
So your argument is that if you defeat the neo-Marxist argument that disparity of outcomes is caused by oppression, then you are sort of setting right the moral order of things?
I don't know that I would say the moral order of things. I would simply say that you are invalidating this blaming of whites. You are taking away the kind of moral blaming that the establishment has used to explain black lack of success. And you can leave it at that. And then you can, of course, in the case of Jared Taylor, he's looking for separation. He's saying that integration has failed and that we have to start thinking of something else, including separation of different races. So I don't know that this separation of different races is a claim to a superior moral order. It's simply a claim to the fact that the races are not getting along. It is based on too many lies and based on accusations against one group that are really unfair.
So you're just seeking to use this evidence to debunk their claims, and then everything will. I see. I do appreciate your answer. Like I said, I appreciate your time. I think it's very interesting that people of the New Right are engaging with this kind of audience. And like I said, I hope you had a pleasant time, and I hope you have a very pleasant day.
All right, thanks for the question.
Okay, I'm going to open this up to Dennis. He has a number of questions. I'll let him articulate them. Dennis, are you there?
Okay. Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me? Is this clear?
Okay. Yeah. Pick one or at least two related points to discuss, and go ahead.
Yeah, I'll ask one question, I think. So, Professor, I thank you for coming over here and spending your time with us. I really appreciate it. So, I mean, there's a lot of things I could ask, but let me ask this. Would you say that the Western civilization, and from what it seems to me in Western history, and at least with regard to philosophy, there's a dedication, there's a constant dedication and attraction to finding truth. And I just want to ask, is this attraction to truth with regard to academic purposes or whatever, is it a constituent of Western society, as opposed to, say, multiculturalism, which today, as we can see, it subverts reality for all the reasons of equality, fairness, etc., etc., etc. And if you say no, what is the thing that you want to say is so unique to the West? What is it that makes a country or a nation West, other than geographical location, of course? That's all.
Well, what you just said, that the pursuit of truth is, in my view, very uniquely Western, but it is not the only characteristic that makes the West the West. Now, of course, the word truth embodies a lot within itself, so you can say the whole Western philosophical tradition was an attempt to pursue truth. So in that sense, it includes that whole tradition, and that tradition, you can say, it's very unique to the West. So I do think that there is something about Europeans that they're not satisfied with living things as they are. Whereas in Asian civilizations and other civilizations, there is a greater inclination to just take the world for what it is and kind of leave it as it is, and yes, make some sense of it and offer some explanations about it. But then once some big thinkers like Confucius and the Mohis in China and Mohammed in the Islamic world set a certain way of thinking about truth, then those things became rigidified, and there were no real efforts to undermine them. There were just variations within those truthful statements as they saw truth there. So in the case of China, you have these major schools of thought: the realistic school, the Taoists, Confucius, and a few others, and then there are variations within those for centuries and centuries. This is not the case in the West. There is a constant debate and challenging all schools. I mean, you even see it amongst the pre-Socratics. One says one thing, the ultimate reality is the earth, the other one says it's air, the other one says it's water. Then Empedocles combines them all. Then Plato has a whole new way of thinking, and then Aristotle, who is a pupil of Plato, challenges his master and goes his own way. And then after Aristotle, his way of thinking breaks down, and you have Epicurus, and thereafter you have the Stoics and the Cynics, and on it goes. And behind this, all of these different individuals are trying to pursue truth, really struggling to make sense of the universe and reality. So truth-telling is very uniquely Western, but it's not the only way to talk about Western uniqueness. You could, as I just said, truth-telling is such a big thing that you can argue, well, technological innovation is a way of truth-telling, is a way of mastering nature and creating powerful machines and so on. But there are many other ways to define the West. So I wouldn't want to give the impression that that's what it's all about, but it is really a very significant defining and it kind of teaches you a lot about the West to actually say that they're so involved in the whole act of pursuing truth. Now, with multiculturalism, as you say, we have a reversal of that. We have, coming right out of the West, this notion that you have to say things that sound nice, that are welcoming to everyone, that include everyone, that don't make people feel bad. So you begin to deny reality. I mean, after the Second World War, in the Western world, they just simply decided flat out that race is not real. And then they prohibited everyone from saying that it is, or from seeking truth about it. Now, we know there are people out there, scientists, who continue to pursue truth in that area, but they are outsiders and they're viewed in a very bad light by most of the academic world. So multiculturalism, one of the harmful aspects about it is that it's just an attempt to curtail and limit the pursuit of truth, which is so unique to the West.
Thank you. That was a fabulous answer. I really appreciate your time. I have many more questions, but I won't be so selfish. Please continue.
All right. Thanks for the question.
All right. Since you're getting tired, I think we're going to limit this to maybe one or two more questions, depending on how long they go. I know InfoCat has one, I think. Do you have one, InfoCat?
Yeah, I can ask one.
Okay, I'll let InfoCat go, and then I think I'll pick one more, depending, and then we'll conclude.
Professor Duchesne, our world is still an extremely fast-changing one, technologically, culturally, demographically. We talk about quite a lot of these trends on here on Uncensored Politics. There's a ton of research currently coming out of the genetics departments and out of evolutionary psychology, out of moral psychology. For example, we have all kinds of studies. I have an entire folder with 15 or 20 of them indicating that there is a demographic shift within first world populations internally. Certain psychological predispositions are selected for. For example, people that are lower on openness to new experience and neuroticism, classical liberal traits. It looks like conservatives, according to quite a lot of data that we have, are out-reproducing liberals. So it could indeed be that we will see drastic political changes over the next generation, everything else, independently of mass immigration, independently of technological changes, potentially that will transform our society back towards the course of sanity. We don't know exactly what will happen. All kinds of changes, like for example, genetic engineering could upend this completely. But do you think that it will be possible for us to either organically via natural transformation of our population, or somehow culturally via cultural or technological revolution to find our way back to sanity, for us to actually regain our civilization with an intellectual movement like the New Right is currently trying?
One of the things about attempting to make any predictions and to even talk about trends, because people like to talk about trends, the way things are going, the way things are heading, and they appeal to all kinds of studies about these findings that this psychologist or this geographer or philosopher has made about the prevailing trends of our time. But in reality, there are all kinds of trends, and many of them are going against each other, conflicting with each other. So you're right that the people who have a conservative inclination are out reproducing the ones that are more liberal. But then at the same time, you have people that are traditionalists in a non-Western sense, arriving in the Western world. And obviously the Muslims are a case in point. So when you talk about conservative trend in the West and how that may counter the liberal trend, then you have to take account of the Muslim trend, which aligns itself with the liberals because they realize the liberals allow them to come in more so and allow them to retain their own customs. And so they vote for multicultural leftist leaders when they themselves are even more conservative than the Western conservatives. So it's a kind of countering trend that utilizes the liberal way of thinking. And then you have other trends like young people who believe in multiple gender identities and they're comfortable with them and they're not marrying and they're divorcing. And then you have that trend. And on it goes. You have the rise of the alt-right, and then that's another trend, and the media raises hysteria about it and how this is the future and there is a reaction and we need to counter it. So I think it's really hard to talk about prevailing trend. We are seeing in the West, and this is part of modernity itself, that it breaks apart communalities, breaks nations into very different things and just singular individual crisscrossing in different directions. And it's all leading to all kinds of tensions and conflicts in the future. And the biggest phenomenon in all of this, in my view, that to me is the singular most important issue, is mass immigration from the third world. I even have no problem with the natural cycles of history and the West just going through a phase of decline if there was no mass immigration, because we can deal with that in the way that China dealt with it. China has gone through many cycles through history, but they have sustained their integrity. But the West, by bringing so many multiple cultures with divergent trends and inclinations, it's just creating chaos and divisions. And so we see this in the United States. And already within the United States, the Black population has never really integrated, and they are going in their own different way. They have different accomplishments and inclinations, and then you have the natives with their own ways, and now the Asians, and there are many types of Asians. So it's just, it really, in many ways, it is a mess in the making. I mean, you look at England, it's just a mess that you see there when you walk through London. And yes, speaking of another trend, and you did make reference to this, the other trend is that science still goes on. We're engaged in a lot of genetic findings and possibilities. And so we have trends that point towards futures that we can imagine, but we cannot really predict how they really are going to be in terms of genetic engineering and all kinds of different technologies that affect human nature and behavior. So those are other trends, and just trends that have to do with people being weaker and not really capable of working as hard as they used to, and being lazier and not marrying and taking more drugs and so on. So it's very hard to talk about as a main trend.
All right. We're going to do one more question, and it's going to bring it back to the issue of Canada. Dreadmaster is going to ask it. So go ahead. Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to my question, Professor. I was curious how you see the effects of revisionism happening currently in Canada affecting us in our future.
You mean revisionism of what? Of history?
Yes, historical revisionism. Your example you said earlier was how the Chinese settlers or immigrants, whatever you wish to call them, are now claiming they were always Canadian.
Right. I mean, statements, I think some of them come, or one of them comes from Dostoevsky, and there's another one from Solzhenitsyn, and they're quite similar. And what both of them say is that if you want to destroy a people, you take away their heritage and their history. You rewrite their history, take away their statues, their monuments, their books. You don't teach their ancestors, you trash them and so on. Because this started with the Bolshevik Revolution, just the tearing down of churches and rewriting the history of the Tsars and so on. So once you do that, it leaves a vacuum for somebody else to fill in that sense of history. So this has been going on for a while in Canada and the West. After they trashed the historical heritage of the European peoples, then the left began to point to other types of history that they think are important. So they emphasize the history of the indigenous peoples to make them more a part of the main narrative, and now the history of immigrants. And so in the case of the book that I was just mentioning by this Chinese, that I don't remember his name, it's just a book that he actually wrote in Chinese with I think has some English in it. I haven't opened the book, I just saw it in an article, but this guy feels like, yeah, these people don't have any sense of history, so we're going to write the history for them. And you're going to see that more and more, that Muslims are going to say, and they're saying this already, and even Merkel in Germany has said it, that Islam is an integral part of German history. So as whites let go of their history, somebody else is going to appropriate it in unison with the left. And they will rewrite, and they already downplay the great achievements. This has been going on for a while now. And I talk about this in Uniqueness, that world historians, they look at every major epoch in Western history, and they want to say that it was made by all the peoples of the world together. So the Renaissance is not really Italian or European, but it's a Mediterranean phenomenon. In which people from the Near East and Africa participated. I have an article on multicultural historians. Actually, this became a chapter, the third chapter in Faustian Man, in which I talk about this a lot, about the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Both of these very European historical transformations are now interpreted as world historical transformations. Even to the point that they say Haitians were involved in the making of the Enlightenment. So these are reinterpretations by European scholars themselves, but recently in the last few years, I'm noticing that now non-Europeans are jumping in and grabbing the history of Europeans as if it was their history and then redefining it, which is to be expected. If you have no respect for your ancestors and you trash it, then other people will dismiss it and then argue that your nation is theirs and that you have to include me, and since I'm better than you morally because you did all kinds of nasty things, then you might as well talk more about me and Africans and Muslims. So really, we have this incredible phenomenon going on.
Yeah, but Professor Duchesne, could I in the end pin you down? Is it possible for us to resurrect our civilization somehow with an intellectual movement?
Well, yeah, it is possible. I mean, that's what I want to do, and that's what I dedicate myself to. I want, like this last book that I wrote on Canada, I mean it as a political statement, and I'm hoping that the mainstream media and the academics will not be able to ignore it, and they're going to have to respond to it, and then it will create a debate in Canada about how they're revising Canadian history. This is one part of the book, and I talk a lot about deceptions throughout the book, how deception is now integral to the academic world. They are deceiving their students, they're outright lying to them. And I want this book to become a debate so that people can think about this. Of course, it is very risky because the establishment will either ignore you, and if they cannot ignore you, they're going to trash you and try and destroy you. And I don't want them to ignore it, because then it cannot be part of a debate. So I'd rather take the risk that they will not ignore it. And yes, they're going to try and trash it, and then I'm going to try and respond to them. So yeah, that's what I'm trying to do, and other people are doing similar things.
We certainly wish you a lot of luck in this endeavor. Maybe you can give us some contact address to your blog, maybe information generally on how to support you financially in this fight.
Yes, well, if you just Google my name, you're going to hit the blog Council of European Canadians, and then you can also find out about the books. And I actually think that buying the last book and then writing good reviews in Amazon is a good thing, because my expectation is that the establishment, if they cannot ignore my book, they're going to try and trash me and just say that I'm a lunatic, a racist, and that I need to be disqualified one way or the other. So if the public out there goes out and buys the book and keeps it up there in the high ranking in Amazon, they will have a harder time ignoring it. And if they write good reviews, then that also works in my favor. So that's what I can say that you people can do in my support.
Certainly, I linked the book just now in education. I will relink it in VoiceChat as well.
All right, thanks.
All right, Professor, we're going to consider this the conclusion of the interview. We appreciate your time. It went very well. I'm sure everybody else appreciates it. I'm going to move you down to lock channel to have some post discussion. But again, thank you very much.
All right, thanks to you and everyone for listening.